We need an adequate facility. Many small churches are in small rooms, small buildings. I've been in a lot of churches that are averaging 30 people, 40 people, 50 people, and honestly, that's all they can fit in the building. Well, you're going to have to find another building. A church of 30, 40, 50 people cannot go to 2 services because you need to have at least about 50 people in the service. You need to have more than one family in the church. Many small churches are just one family. I mean a real family. Mother, father, some kids, and some aunts and nephews and uncles and cousins. Those types of churches don't grow. They'll grow as far as the network of the family grows, and then they stop. And you've got to break out of the single family environment and begin to include other families into the church. If you're here from a small church, you've got to break out of just the one family system in the church. You've got to embrace other families in the church and let them have authority, let them have position in the church. And as you do, you increase the network that you can reach out to in winning people to faith in Christ, and you increase the ability of the church to grow. Every small church needs at least 2 ministries. You need a worship ministry, which is the preaching and the teaching and the music, and you need a children's ministry. You need a children's ministry. You need to start reaching out to families with young children. You've got to target young families with children. You've got to build that nursery. You've got to make it nice. You've got to reach out and build ministries that will reach out to people with young children. You need to reach a critical mass of 50 people. This is a well-known figure in church planting. Most churches that start from scratch, they try not to open their doors until they know that they'll have at least 50 people in the audience. And that doesn't count the people who are on the platform. The reason for that is that you have to get to about 50 people who are clapping and singing and raising their hands and praising God before there's a dynamic feel in the worship area. So these are things you have to work on. I mean, you just can't make them happen. But you got to reach out to new people. You got to embrace people into the faith, embrace them into the church. You've got to let new people come in and take positions in the church, even if they're not part of the main family. You've got to work at getting that pastor full time. You got to work at building up a congregation that's at least 50 people in the audience. And when you start hitting those levels, when you start getting that full-time pastor and you start getting some new people and you start getting that mass of 50 people, the church begins to take on the character of a dynamic feel, because worship is different and service is different and the preaching is better and the pastor's ministry is better because of the time involvement and things like that. Well, this is a difficult place. Because the church is often so small that it just doesn't reach any of these criteria. And so it takes a lot of effort and a lot of work and a lot of prayer to get up over this first level. But these are some of the things you've got to work towards. Well, what if you're a church of around 85 and you want to get up to maybe around 125? What are some things you need to typically do? Well, you need to increase the ministries that you offer. You still need worship and you still need children's ministry, but you also need a ministry to the women. When you get up around 80 people in the church, you need to start having a women's ministry, and you need some sort of men's ministry in the church, and maybe a youth ministry. But I want to impress upon you, children's ministry is more important than youth ministry. Children's ministry brings adults. Youth ministry doesn't always bring adults to your church. And if you're going to grow your church, you've got to get adults into the church. So if it was me, I would put the emphasis upon children's ministry over a youth ministry. However, if you happen to reach people who have a lot of teenagers, then you're probably going to have to provide something for them. But if you only have one teenager or two teenagers or three teenagers, don't go hiring a youth pastor thinking that you're going to build the 2 or 3 teenagers into a youth ministry, it probably won't happen. And it's not worth the investment. Invest the money in children's ministry and grow your youth ministry from the children up as the children grow up. Then add your youth ministry. You need to have 3 adult ministries outside of Sunday morning worship. So if you have Sunday morning worship and you add a men's ministry, that's 1 ministry outside of adult worship. If you add a women's ministry, that's 2. You need to add a 3rd ministry. There needs to be a 3rd ministry for adults. Essentially, what you want to do is you want to have 3 adult ministries for every 100 adults in your church. So as your church grows, you know, if you're 100 and you grow to 100 and say 30, you want to add another adult ministry. So a church of 130 ought to have 4 adult ministries. So 3 adult ministries for every 100 adults in the church is what you're aiming for. Again, you need an adequate facility. You might be in a facility that seats 70, 80 people. Well, if you're going to grow to 125, you're going to need to have a bigger facility to do it. Or you're going to have to go to 2 worship services. But here's the problem. Anytime you go to an extra worship service, you need a minimum of 50 people in the audience to maintain a vibrant worship atmosphere. So if you're 85 people and you go to the 2 services, one of them will probably have 60 people in it and the other will have 20. Well, the one that has 20 is not vibrant. It's too small. So a church of 80 or so can't go to 2 services. Even a church of 125, it's difficult to go to 2 services because you need to have at least 50 people in each worship service. So usually if you're somewhere around 80, 90 people and you've maxed out your facility, the answer is you've got to find another facility that's bigger. Now, probably the most well-known principle of church growth is this, that when a worship service gets to be 80% full, the church stops growing. When a worship service gets to be 80% full, the church stops growing. I want to tell you something. We're discovering today that that's wrong. That's wrong. You know what the new rule is? When a church worship service gets 70% full, it stops growing. Now, you're going to see some churches that are packed out, and people are more, the church facility may be 110% full, but that doesn't last forever. Eventually, people get tired of the church being that crowded, and they begin to drift away. And you know who drifts away? It's the new people. Because the new people come in and the church is too crowded, and they tend to drift away. Now, the normal people who are in the church on a regular basis, they love it because it's so exciting. We have to bring in extra chairs and things like that. Oh, that's wonderful. Our church is growing. But the new people come in, and it's just too crowded, and they tend to drift away. So the minute look at the facility your church is in. How many people can you put in your facility? And if you're upwards of 70% full, you need to start looking at another facility. And you need to move into that facility probably when you get up to around 80, 90% full in your old facility, if you're at this size level. You need to add a half-time secretary. Now, I'm assuming here that you've got your full-time pastor. I should tell you that. By the time you reach 85 to 125 people, you should have a full-time pastor. You should be able to definitely have a full-time pastor paying them a decent wage when you've got 70-some people in your church. I would say at least by 75 people in the church, you should be able to pay a decent wage to your pastor. By the time you get to 125, you ought to have a full-time pastor and you ought to have a secretary who works at least half-time in the church and starts taking some of the administrative responsibility away from the pastor so the pastor can invest more time in ministry and not strictly administration. All right, let's go on. What about 200? All right. Let's say you want to get over 200 people in your church. What are some of the things that you need to do? Here are some of the typical things. You need to add a second pastor. A second pastor. And you need to add a full-time secretary. So that part-time secretary moves to full-time. And you add a second pastor. Now here's the problem. You know what the problem is. You don't have enough money to pay 2 full-time pastors. So what you have to do is you have to get creative. By having a second full-time pastor, I don't mean that you have to have an ordained pastor. I don't even mean you have to have a seminary-trained pastor. What you have to have is somebody who fulfills a pastoral function or role in your church. It could be 2 part-time people. You might have a part-time, maybe a lady in the church who stays home with her children. Her husband works a job. She stays home with her children. Her children are in school, and she could volunteer, or she could work part-time salary for 20 hours a week, and maybe she could take care of the whole assimilation process of welcoming new people into your church. Maybe you would have another person who could become a part-time children's director. And so you pay them part-time. You don't have to pay them benefits. But the 2 of them together constitute a full-time person. So maybe that's your second pastor. So think creatively here. I'm not talking about an ordained pastor or a seminary-trained pastor. If you can do that, fine. But if you can't, then you get creative and you hire 2 part-time people. But you're not going to usually grow bigger than 200 with 1 pastor. Normally you have to have 2 pastors to get above 200. You need to have a new group. Now, by new groups, I'm thinking here small groups now. Normally when the church is smaller, you don't need small groups. And the reason is that small churches are already a small group. Small groups provide pastoral care and love and support during times of illness and sickness and concern that people have. When a church is small, typically people are part of a family or maybe 2 or 3 family units, and if they need support, they get it through the family. But as a church gets bigger and it gets to be more complex, sometimes you get a lot of people who aren't part of the families in the church, and the way they get support and love and care is through the small group ministry. So usually as a church approaches 200, you have to start developing a small group ministry. And there's lots of different ways to do small groups. I don't think there's any particular one way. You know, today a lot of people are enamored with the G12 movement. Okay, that's fine. That's a good movement. But that's not for every church. It works some places. It doesn't work other places. Find a small group methodology that works for your church and use it. And start adding 1 small group for every 15 adults in the church. A pastor needs to begin to focus on managing the church ministry. Now, what I mean here is, when a church is below 200, pastors normally focus on pastoral care. They meet with people, they pray with people, they visit people in the hospital, and they care for them. As a church gets bigger, a pastor has to begin to release the pastoral care to other people in the church. And when a church gets up around 200, a pastor has to begin to be more of a manager of the overall ministry of the church. Managing the organization, managing the coordination of what goes on in the church. That means, of course, then, that the pastor must release other people in the church into ministry. And this is a very difficult thing for some pastors. Some pastors like to do everything. You know, they like to care for people. They like to start new ministries. They like to manage the funds of the church or whatever. And they're running around trying to do it all. Well, your church will never get bigger than 200 if as a pastor you're trying to do everything. And so what you have to do is you have to let other people do things in the church. So you cease doing pastoral care and you start letting lay people in the church do pastoral care. You cease doing management of finances and you get somebody in the church to manage the finances. You cease doing the cleaning of the church facility and you get other people in the church to clean the church facility. Otherwise, you start giving ministry away to other people. And as you give ministry away to other people and let them do it, the church begins to grow and to develop. Again, you have to expand your facilities. If a church will only grow to 70% of its facility size to get 200 people into one worship service, that means you have to have 250 seats in the auditorium. Many of you are better at mathematics than me. You can just figure it out. If I want to average 200 people on a Sunday morning in one worship service, I've got to have 250 seats in my auditorium. Because when I get to 70% full, I'll start declining as a church. So all the way along here, you've got to think about the facility, about where you're meeting, and how many people you can begin to fit into the worship service. You have to keep your structure simple. Don't get too complex in the overall structure of the church. I'm talking about decision-making, voting, choosing of leaders, things like that. Keep it very simple. One board, no committees. Okay? If your church has got committees, my recommendation to you is do away with committees. You have one board, and if you want something done, you assign it to one person. Now, if that one person wants to recruit some people onto a team to help them, that's great. But a team is not a committee. A team is a group of people who work together to get something done. They're not elected, they're not appointed. But you give responsibility to one person. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but if you have committees don't do anything. Committees sit around, they talk, they discuss, but they don't perform. People do things. So get rid of the committees and assign jobs to people. Because people you can hold accountable. Mary, how did that assignment go? See, I can ask Mary. I can't say, committee, how did the assignment go? Because nobody on the committee feels responsible for doing it. So keep the structure. Don't get into bureaucracy in the church. Keep everything very slim, very trim when it comes to structure. Add a second worship service. If you're going to break 200, one of the things that we've discovered in church growth research that almost always has to happen is you have to add a second worship service. It is very rare for a church to grow beyond 200 without a second worship service. Now, when you try and go to a second worship service, as I said before, what people are going to say to you are, Pastor, we're going to be two churches. Pastor, we won't see everybody we love and care for. And your answer is this, you're right. We will be two churches. And you're right. There'll be some people we won't see. But we're still going to do it. Why are we going to do it? Because the church isn't for us. The church is for them out there who need to know Jesus Christ. And so we have to make room for those people who don't know Jesus Christ to come in and find a place to sit. Did you ever think about this? When you came to church as a brand new person, somebody in that church you went to moved over and let you have their seat. Did you ever notice that? If you came to Christ as an adult and you came to church as a new non-believing person or even a new believer, somebody in the church moved over and let you have a place to sit. You need to move over and let somebody else have a place to sit. The people in your church need to move over and let some of the new people have a place to sit. And the way we do that is to go to a second service, to make room for more people in the church. And if we can't go to a second service, then we got to go to a bigger auditorium. So we create more places for the new believer to sit in the church. These are the things that normally have to happen for a church to get above 200. Now, in order to do this, this is not on your chart, okay? This is not on your piece of paper. In order to do this, Pastor, to get above 200, you've got to start mentoring leaders. You've got to be training other people as leaders. And I would recommend this to you. You need to think of this as you there in the middle. And really, this isn't just pastors. This is any leader in the church. You need to be mentoring other people. If you're on the board, if you're an elder, you need to be mentoring a future person to be a future elder. If you're a teacher, you need to be mentoring a future teacher to take over and be a teacher in your church. If you're a small group leader, you need to be mentoring small group leaders who could take over and be another small group leader of another group someday in the future. So it's not just pastors. But think of yourself in the middle there. You need someone above you who can mentor you. You only need one person above you. And by above you, what I mean is you need somebody who has traveled the road of life and the road of ministry further than you have. If you're a pastor in a church of 50 people, see if you can find a pastor in a church of 100 that used to be 50. And the pastor grew the church from 50 to 100. Go to that pastor and say, would you teach me what you did to get your church up to 100? I've got